The Gulf War entered history as a short war, but that memory only works if you start the clock late. Most people remember a blur of jets, missiles, and tanks tearing across the desert. That image stayed in public memory, yet the result was built long before the famous ground attack began. Everything started on August 2, 1990, when Saddam Hussein sent Iraqi forces into Kuwait and shocked the world. The invasion sent fear across the region, especially once people began wondering whether Saudi Arabia could be next. What followed was larger than one fast strike on television. By the time coalition forces launched the 100-hour ground offensive, months of build-up, planning, and bombing had already shaped the outcome. After the shooting stopped, another phase followed as troops returned home and the war's image hardened into something clean, fast, and almost effortless. Desert Storm looked like a lightning strike. In reality, it was a war built in stages: deterrence, destruction, maneuver, and withdrawal. On August 2, 1990, Iraqi forces rolled into Kuwait and crushed the country with shocking speed. Tanks crossed the border, troops seized key positions, and the ruling family fled as Saddam Hussein tried to turn a neighboring state into a prize. Around the world, the invasion looked like a regional crisis. In Washington, Riyadh, and other capitals, leaders saw something larger taking shape in the desert. Saddam had reasons for the gamble, though none made the move less dangerous. Iraq came out of the war with Iran battered by debt, short on cash, and hungry for leverage. Kuwait's oil production and financial disputes gave Baghdad a target close at hand. Saddam also believed power, fear, and speed could force everyone else to accept a new reality before a serious response came together. The invasion sent a shock through the Gulf far beyond Kuwait's borders. Saudi Arabia suddenly looked exposed, especially once Iraqi forces sat so close to its frontier. That fear changed everything. A local conquest became a global emergency the moment American planners and Saudi leaders started thinking about oil fields, ports, air bases, and the chance of a wider collapse across the region. President George H.W. Bush moved fast, framing the crisis as a line that had to hold. The United States would defend Saudi Arabia, protect the flow of oil, and build a coalition large enough to isolate Saddam politically before trying to break him militarily. That decision became Operation Desert Shield. At first, the mission centered on deterrence, a message aimed at Baghdad as much as reassurance for anxious allies. American troops began arriving in Saudi Arabia within days, and the early deployments carried enormous symbolic weight. Fighter aircraft, airborne units, and Marines came first, followed by heavier forces built for a much longer struggle. Those opening arrivals told the world that the United States was planting itself in the desert for real. They also told Saddam that any move south would trigger a fight with a superpower. As the weeks passed, Desert Shield grew into something massive. Cargo planes landed around the clock, ships unloaded armor, and entire formations poured into the kingdom until the sand was crowded with men, vehicles, fuel, and ammunition. What looked at first like a defensive shield slowly became the foundation for an offensive hammer. Every runway expanded, every supply dump filled, and every convoy hinted at a war still waiting for its formal start. This build-up mattered for another reason: America was never acting alone. Britain, France, Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and many others joined the coalition, each for their own mix of security, diplomacy, and national interest. That alliance gave the coming war legitimacy in a way raw firepower alone never could. Saddam had invaded one small country. In response, he found himself facing a broad international front with money, aircraft, ships, and political cover. The standoff dragged on through the fall, and that long wait shaped the mood of the whole campaign. Soldiers trained in the heat, dug positions into the desert, and prepared for chemical attack while diplomats worked through the United Nations. From the outside, the pause could look uneventful. Inside the camps, everyone understood the opposite. Time was sharpening both armies, tightening the coalition, and bringing the region closer to a deadline that felt unavoidable. By late 1990, the crisis had a harder edge. The United Nations demanded Iraqi withdrawal, and the clock began to run toward January 1991. That deadline changed the tone from build-up to expectation. Desert Shield still carried the language of defense, yet the coalition sitting in Saudi Arabia had grown far beyond a tripwire force. Air power, armor, artillery, and logistics were now in place for a campaign that could strike with overwhelming force. That is what made Desert Shield so important. This phase was more than waiting in the sand while cameras searched for action. It was the period when the coalition drew the line, built the machine, and made clear that Saddam would either leave Kuwait or face a war on terms he could barely survive. By the time the deadline arrived, the storm people remember had already been forming for months. In the early hours of January 17, 1991, the waiting ended. Coalition aircraft crossed into Iraqi airspace and opened Desert Storm with a wave of strikes meant to blind, confuse, and paralyze. Television audiences saw flashes over Baghdad and assumed the war had begun in full that night. In reality, this opening move was designed to tear apart the system holding Iraq's military together. The first target showed exactly what kind of campaign this would be. Command bunkers, communication centers, radar sites, and air defense networks took the earliest hits as coalition planners tried to break Iraq's ability to see, speak, and respond. A modern army can survive heavy pressure for a while. Once its nerves are cut, every unit becomes weaker, slower, and more isolated. Baghdad became the symbol of the air war, yet the campaign reached far beyond the capital. Airfields, bridges, supply depots, power systems, and military infrastructure across Iraq and occupied Kuwait came under attack. Each strike served a larger purpose. Coalition leaders wanted the Iraqi army trapped in place, cut off from support, and forced to fight under conditions that kept getting worse by the day. Air superiority came quickly, and that changed the shape of the conflict. Iraqi pilots flew some sorties, then found themselves badly outmatched by coalition technology, training, and coordination. Many aircraft were destroyed, others stayed grounded, and some fled to Iran rather than face destruction in the sky. From that point forward, coalition forces could operate above the battlefield with growing freedom. The bombing also targeted the Iraqi army sitting in Kuwait. Trenches, artillery positions, armored units, fuel sites, and supply routes took repeated punishment as planners worked to soften defenses before the ground assault. This was never just spectacle over Baghdad. Day after day, the battlefield in Kuwait was being reshaped into a place where Iraqi troops would face attack while tired, exposed, and cut off. Psychology mattered almost as much as physical damage. Iraqi soldiers lived under constant threat from the sky, often with little warning and almost no safe feeling anywhere near the front. Sleep broke down, morale eroded, and trust in leadership weakened under the pressure. An army can still fire weapons while its confidence is collapsing. That kind of force becomes far easier to break once a ground attack begins. Then came the Scuds. Saddam launched ballistic missiles toward Israel and Saudi Arabia, trying to widen the war and fracture the coalition by pulling Israel into direct combat. That move carried real danger. Arab partners had joined a campaign to reverse the invasion of Kuwait, and a broader regional war could have torn that political balance apart. The coalition scrambled to contain that risk. Patriot missile batteries became one of the most famous images of the war, while aircraft hunted mobile launchers across western Iraq in a difficult search. Publicly, the message centered on defense and reassurance. Privately, leaders understood that keeping Israel out of the fight was essential if the coalition was going to hold together through the entire campaign. Meanwhile, the air campaign kept grinding forward with relentless pressure. Sortie after sortie hit supply lines, armored formations, transportation networks, and the pieces Iraq needed to sustain a long defense in Kuwait. This methodical destruction rarely looked dramatic in the same way a tank breakthrough would later appear. Its effect was even more important, since it hollowed out the battlefield before the ground war ever arrived. By early February, Iraqi forces in Kuwait were facing a harsher reality than the maps alone could show. Units had been battered, moved less freely, and struggled to communicate under constant attack. Equipment losses mattered, though the deeper damage ran through organization, confidence, and control. Coalition planners were shaping a battlefield where the coming ground assault would meet resistance from pieces rather than from one coherent defense. television coverage helped create one version of the war while the bombing continued. Viewers saw green night vision images, precision weapons, and a campaign that seemed almost clinical from a distance. That presentation made the fighting look cleaner than it felt on the receiving end. For Iraqi troops pinned in Kuwait, the air war was a long process of attrition, fear, and shrinking options. By the time the ground offensive approached, the coalition had already done much of its most important work. Iraq still held territory, yet its forces in Kuwait had been weakened physically, disrupted mentally, and cut apart operationally. That was the hidden truth beneath the famous sprint to come. The 100-hour war would look sudden on screen, though the battlefield had been prepared for weeks from the air. On February 24, 1991, the coalition finally launched the ground offensive. After weeks of air strikes, the war entered the phase most people remember: tanks moving, artillery firing, and units racing across open desert. For television audiences, this looked like the true beginning. For the soldiers crossing the line, it felt more like the moment months of preparation were finally cashing in. The attack did not unfold as one blunt charge straight into the strongest Iraqi positions. Coalition planners had spent weeks shaping a far more flexible assault, one built to pin forces in place while major formations swung wide through the western desert. That maneuver became famous as the left hook. Its power came from surprise, space, and timing rather than from sheer spectacle alone. Iraqi commanders had prepared for a brutal frontal struggle in and around Kuwait. Trenches, berms, minefields, and fixed defenses reflected that expectation, along with the belief that the coalition would have to pay heavily for every mile. Instead, those assumptions started collapsing as the attack widened and the battlefield opened from directions Iraqi planners had feared less. A defense built to absorb pressure began failing once it had to turn and react. Marine and Arab coalition forces hit the front in Kuwait and fixed Iraqi attention where Saddam's army expected the main blow to land. That pressure mattered even beyond the territory gained. It helped keep defenders tied to positions while larger armored formations moved elsewhere for the decisive strike. A war can be won through misdirection as much as destruction, and this campaign was proving that in real time. Far to the west, American and coalition armored units pushed through the desert with speed that Iraqi commanders struggled to match. The battlefield there looked empty from a distance, yet that emptiness gave maneuver forces room to cut behind defenses and threaten entire formations at once. Once those columns got into position, Iraqi units faced danger from the side and rear instead of from one expected front. Some Iraqi units fought hard when contact came. There were firefights, artillery duels, and pockets of real resistance across the front, especially where defenders still had structure and leadership left. Even so, the larger pattern was turning against them fast. A damaged army can still resist in isolated places, though its ability to hold a theater begins slipping once communication breaks down and movement becomes chaotic. The coalition's advantage showed up in more than firepower. Training, coordination, navigation, logistics, and battlefield awareness gave attacking forces an edge that Iraqi units could barely answer under those conditions. American and Allied formations moved with a level of control Saddam's army could seldom match after weeks under air attack. That gap turned clashes into something sharper than a contest of numbers. It became a contest of systems, and one side was far more intact. As the attack gathered pace, Iraqi defenses in Kuwait started giving way. Units retreated, surrendered, or became stranded as lines bent and then broke under pressure from several directions. The ground war moved so quickly that the collapse itself became part of the story. What looked from afar like an unstoppable rush was really the visible release of pressure built across months of planning and weeks of bombardment. Kuwait City was liberated as Iraqi control unraveled. For many watching around the world, that moment delivered the clearest symbol of coalition success. The country whose invasion had started the crisis was being reclaimed in a matter of days. Liberation brought celebration, relief, and powerful images for the cameras. Behind those scenes sat a harsher reality, with wrecked vehicles, shattered infrastructure, and a country scarred by occupation and war. As Iraqi units withdrew north, order often gave way to disorder. roads filled with retreating vehicles, damaged equipment, and formations trying to escape a battlefield that had turned against them with terrifying speed. One of the most enduring images from that retreat came on the road later remembered as the Highway of Death. It remains among the most controversial scenes of the war, a reminder that even a lopsided victory carries grim human wreckage. What made the campaign so startling was the tempo. Coalition forces kept moving, kept cutting, and kept forcing Iraqi units into choices they could no longer manage well. A defensive army already weakened from the air now had to survive a fast-moving ground assault against better-equipped opponents hitting from multiple directions. Under that pressure, the larger Iraqi position in Kuwait ceased to function as a coherent whole. Within roughly 100 hours, the offensive had achieved its main goals. Kuwait had been liberated, Iraqi formations had been smashed or driven back, and the coalition stood in position to go farther if leaders chose that path. That speed stunned much of the world. It also reinforced the myth that the war had been easy, as though the collapse happened out of thin air rather than out of careful preparation. Then came the halt. President Bush declared that Kuwait was liberated and announced the suspension of offensive combat operations, bringing the campaign to a close before coalition forces drove all the way to Baghdad. That decision shaped the war's legacy almost as much as the victory itself. The mission had been framed around reversing the invasion, and in military terms that mission had been accomplished with overwhelming force. This was the phase that entered legend, a ground war so fast it seemed almost unreal. Tanks swept forward, defenses collapsed, and the entire campaign looked from the outside like a lightning victory achieved in 4 days. Yet that version only tells the final act. The 100-hour war became famous precisely since the battlefield had already been broken open long before the first ground columns surged ahead. When the ground offensive stopped, the war entered a different phase almost immediately. Coalition leaders had achieved the central objective, Kuwait was free, Iraqi forces had been driven out, and the campaign that looked huge on paper had ended with stunning speed. Across the alliance, relief mixed with calculation as commanders and politicians turned from destruction to closure. A battlefield victory had been secured. Now came the work of freezing that result into a stable political ending before events on the ground could pull the conflict in a wider direction. The ceasefire brought its own set of hard choices. Saddam Hussein remained in power, even after the collapse of his army in Kuwait, and that fact surprised many people who had watched the war unfold on television. Washington had chosen to reverse the invasion rather than march all the way to Baghdad and topple the regime. That decision matched the coalition's stated mission, though it also left a dangerous ruler in place. Victory had clear limits, and those limits would matter more as the first glow of success began to fade. Inside Iraq, the aftermath quickly turned bloody in ways many outsiders did not fully grasp at first. Uprisings broke out in the south and north as groups who hated Saddam sensed weakness and hoped his defeat might open the door to collapse. Instead, the regime survived and struck back with brutal force. Those scenes did not fit the cleaner public image forming abroad. While Americans celebrated a rapid triumph, Iraq was entering another stretch of fear, repression, and instability under the same leadership that had started the war. Meanwhile, coalition troops began heading home, and that return became its own chapter under the label Desert Farewell. Redeployment lacked the drama of the air campaign or the ground sprint, yet it mattered for the story people would carry away from 1991. Soldiers embraced families, units packed equipment, and television coverage shifted from fireballs and tank columns to homecoming scenes filled with relief and pride. Those images helped close the war emotionally for the American public. They also made the whole conflict feel tidier than war usually is. Public memory formed fast once the troops started coming back. Desert Storm became the model of a clean, efficient, high-tech American victory, a campaign that seemed to prove the military had buried the ghosts of Vietnam and entered a new era of dominance. Precision strikes, short timelines, and low coalition losses all fed that belief. In many minds, the Gulf War looked like the perfect modern war. Speed became the headline, and complexity slipped into the background where fewer people bothered to look. That image had real power in Washington too. Leaders, planners, and commentators treated the war as proof that overwhelming force, advanced technology, and coalition diplomacy could solve major crises with remarkable efficiency. Confidence surged across American politics and military culture during the early 1990s. Yet every war teaches lessons unevenly. Some conclusions drawn from Desert Storm were sound. Others would age less well once future conflicts turned messier, longer, and more resistant to the kind of quick resolution people had just watched in Kuwait. Questions lingered beneath the triumph even in that first moment of celebration. Saddam was still in Baghdad. American forces would keep a major presence in the region. Sanctions, no-fly zones, and unfinished tensions meant the story had ended in one sense while continuing in another. For viewers at home, the war seemed over. For the Middle East, the conflict had simply shifted into a new shape with old dangers still alive beneath the surface. That is why Desert Farewell matters, even without the spectacle of the earlier phases. This was the period when victory got packed, labeled, and placed into public memory as a short, sharp, almost effortless success. Such a version carried truth, though only part of it. The campaign had indeed moved with extraordinary speed once the ground war began. Still, the larger result came from months of build-up, weeks of air attack, a rapid armored blow, and an exit that sealed one clean version of a far more complicated war. Desert Storm lives in memory as a lightning war, a campaign so fast it seemed to arrive, strike, and end almost at once. That version survived for a reason. The ground assault moved with breathtaking speed, and the images on television burned that final sprint into history. Yet the famous 100 hours were only the last visible burst of a much larger sequence. First came the line in the sand, then the air campaign that hollowed out Iraq's position, then the armored blow that shattered what remained, and finally the withdrawal that helped freeze the public meaning of the war. What looked simple from afar was built step by step. That is the real story of Desert Storm. It was never just a sprint across the desert. It was deterrence, destruction, maneuver, and departure, each phase feeding the next until victory looked easier than it truly was.